For Polity in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Joining me today is author Kally Forrest to talk about her book, Lydia, Anthem to the Unity of Women, a biography that promises to open your eyes and touch your heart. Kally, your book tells the remarkable story of Lydia Komape, who was born in the small village of Matlala in Limpopo, and who would later find herself serving in Nelson Mandela's parliament. Tell us a bit about Lydia's childhood and how, at the age of 14, apartheid South Africa's land dispossession and segregation destroyed her family's life.
Yeah, I think I should just first explain that her father was a sharecropper. And a sharecropper is essentially somebody who's given some land. In this case, it was given to him by the Lutheran Church in a little village called Matlala in Limpopo. And you're given some land on which you work, and you have to give part of your produce to the church, part of the produce to the chief, and the rest you take for yourself. And so Lydia's family, I would say, they weren't well off, but they certainly weren't poor. And she grew up in that kind of environment. She worked very, very hard. There were certain things that the family required of her. So she plowed, she went and she collected wood and she collected water, and she took grain and other crops to the mills to be ground and so on. And then outside of that, I would say she was relatively free. But what happened, which I think is an interesting thing because it's often forgotten in history. On the one side, we know about the 1913 Land Act, which basically took away Black people's land. And then we also know in the 1980s or late 1970s, 1980s, all sorts of resettlement schemes and how people were relocated chiefly to very small homelands. But something happened in between that, and that happened not under the apartheid government, but actually happened under Smuts' Liberal government in 1935, and it was known as the Betterment Scheme. And basically, I think it was well-intentioned in the sense that it was a kind of developmental idea that the land would be split into three parts. Part would be for agriculture, part for livestock, cattle, goats and pigs and so on, and part for settlement. But it went horribly wrong. And basically what happened was that local farmers came for example, into Lydia's area and simply took cattle that they thought was subpar and took away that cattle. So Lydia's father had 30 livestock, and by the time it had been taken away from him, he had 6. And Lydia explained how I think they had a very large portion of land, but by the time the land had been reallocated, they had about 0.6 of a hectare to plant crops and fruit and so on. And also what happened was the whole idea was to bring all these villages in the area together, and they would all live together. And so a whole lot of new people were brought into the village of Matlala. And actually you can still see it today. They sort of on the side of the hill, they're not integrated into the community. People's local customs and traditions were completely ignored, and it became very overcrowded. So if you like, the whole social fabric of the village was destroyed. And before that, as Lydia had said, there were no poor people. But after that, her father, who was really pretty broken by this experience, he just sort of faded away. Lydia's mother was forced to go and work in Johannesburg. She worked for a family as a domestic worker in Hyde Park. And then Lydia pretty soon after that gave up her dreams of being a nurse, of being a teacher and so on, and realized that she too would have to go to Johannesburg, and initially worked as a domestic worker and then later worked in a factory, in the Heinemann Electric factory. So basically the whole family was shattered and fragmented.
Lydia's first husband was abusive, and violence against women was a constant theme in her life. She made it her mission to challenge patriarchy and developed a deep connection to rural women who were often treated as subordinates with no rights. Could you share more about Lydia's efforts to fight this inequality?
Yeah, I think just as a backdrop, in the book, you'll see there are three generations of patriarchal violence, of men towards their wives. Not so much their children at that time, but certainly Lydia's father was extremely violent to her mother, often beat her up and hit her and so on. And Lydia describes how her mother ran into the hills because this little village was surrounded by hills. It was just like in a little basin. And she would often sleep overnight in the hills. And then, very sadly, Lydia replicated this. She was very much in love with her husband, actually. Rogwam was his name. And he was very protective. He wanted her to do exactly what he wanted her to do, which was to sew and knit and so on and provide for the family. By then in Sophiatown, they had moved to Johannesburg. And if she put up any kind of resistance, she was beaten, she was hit, and so on. And, I interviewed her children, and the elder daughter told me how she would stand outside the bedroom door and she would hear her mother being thumped and hit and so on and screaming and shouting. And she felt absolutely impotent to do anything. And then, very sadly, both of Lydia's two daughters also were victims of violence, particularly the elder daughter, the one who told me that story, Nogo, to the point where her son actually said to her, "Look, Mom, I think we just have to leave this place because you're going to get murdered." So she came from that kind of ethos of extreme patriarchal violence. And I think that's what really made her, if you like, a feminist. But, when I use the word feminist, I use quite carefully because Black Women's Organization at that time didn't like the word, didn't like the title and the naming of feminist. They saw it as a European idea. They saw it as an American construct. And so they never spoke about themselves as feminists. But I really have no doubt that Mam Lydia was a feminist because she was quite influenced by socialist feminists of the time, white women that she worked with. And they sort of spoke about the triple oppression of women. And that triple oppression was, first of all, the race oppression, then the patriarchal oppression, and then oppression at work, in the sense that they didn't earn the same salaries as men, they didn't get any kind of promotion. Not that there was a lot of leeway for Black men to be promoted at that time, but there was some, and women were never part of that. And Mam Lydia certainly subscribed, to that kind of concept of the triple oppression. And I think what's really important is that when she went into the unions, she started organizing men, and she was quite effective actually in organizing men. It's quite funny, that part of the book. She talks about these big Zulu men that she had to organize. But she ended up organizing cleaners from what was then AMPROS, the Anglo-American Property Services. There was an in-house cleaning service. And there were a lot of victories there. She managed to get them increased wages and conditions and so on. But what she did was she took it beyond that, and she set up the AMPROS Women's Forum. And the Women's Forum was basically not to talk about work issues, but to talk about the oppression of women and what happened to them at home, how their husbands treated them, how they were exploited by their husbands, how in the society generally they were seen as inferior. And she talks a lot about that in the book. I mean, I explain it quite a lot. But it was that idea, and the woman started to get pushy, to such a point that they were very influential, and this will be quite surprise you, in Kasatu around the 6 months paid maternity leave. They made that demand from this women's forum. And of course, at that time, there was no maternity leave at all. Women were just fired if they got pregnant. And nowadays, of course, as you know, we have 4 months maternity leave in legislation, and it comes from that very source. And Lydia then took that idea into the rural areas when she went back to work in the rural areas and left the unions. She took that idea, but she found that women in the rural areas were extremely isolated. Unlike women that she had organized at AMPROS, there was unity, they were all working together, they came together every day. These women were very isolated, and they were very ashamed about the fact that their husbands might have taken another wife in the rural areas, or that their husband hadn't sent money home that month for them to use on the children, or perhaps that a daughter had gone to the local village and become a sex worker because there was no money in the family. Nobody spoke about these things. And Mam Lydia started to tell stories and explain what had happened to her in her marriage and how she had also been beaten up and so on. And slowly these women started talking. And then they came together in the area and started talking to each other and sharing these experiences. And through that, realizing that it wasn't their fault that they were in this position. It was a societal thing. It was a patriarchal thing. And that, sort of gave them a huge amount of power. And then Mam Lydia thought, look, these women are all coming together. They need to come together across the Northwest. They need to come together in Mpumalanga. They need to come together in Gauteng or whatever. And out of that came the idea of the rural women's movement, where women came together and made their demands very publicly, very openly, and very powerfully, actually. And that was really her idea. And the rural women's movement still exists today, actually.
In 1975, while working at Heinemann Electric in Elandsfontein, Lydia met trade unionist Gavin Anderson and began to attend union meetings. At the time, it was rare for women to rise as leaders within the trade union movement, but Lydia became a strong, clear voice. Tell us about her journey in the unions and in community organizations.
Yeah, I think Mam Lydia made the decision not to get deeply involved in community organizations, because she wanted to dedicate herself to the trade unions. But she nevertheless had connections, and she was often asked to speak and talk about her experience of organizing women in the trade unions. But I think a defining thing about Lydia was that she was not afraid to say, I don't understand. I don't know how that works. Tell me how you do that. And she was very open to learning. And I think Gavin Anderson and Sipho Kabega were two early organizers in what was then known as MAWU, the Metal and Allied Workers Union. It's now called NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. And they explained things to her, and they were extremely respectful to her. So you'll see, like in the book, she talks about she hated whites because of what had happened in the rural area and how whites had just taken their land and taken their cattle and so on. But she suddenly met this man who was calling her Mam Lydia, who was very respectful, who would pass around a bottle of Coke, because they used to sort of hide behind a bush and organize so they wouldn't be seen by the bosses at that time. And he would pass around a bottle of Coke and everybody would drink from it, including him. And it really changed her attitude profoundly to understanding that there were different kinds of whites. Gavin was absolutely crucial in that. But I think what Gavin and Sipho chiefly did for her is they educated her in the idea that organization is king, or if you like, is queen. At that time, I think perhaps we don't understand that everything was done through organization and through unity. And that was how you built your strength, and that's how you resisted the state. And so she learned to organize in a very empathetic way. She would listen very carefully to her members, to their grievances, to their complaints. And she was also a very good speaker and storyteller. So she would educate through speaking and telling stories about all sorts of experiences that she'd had. And what she did was she saw herself as an equal, and she kind of wove an understanding with them on what needed to be done. And I think this is quite a critical point with Mam Lydia, is she didn't listen empathetically and hope that people would feel better because they had spoken about their issues. She wanted change, and she was very concerned to bring about change. And so, of course, if you're going to bring about change, you have to talk about strategy and tactics. And she was very sharp at that and very good at doing that. I've said that she was a very empathetic listener, and she was, but she was also very outspoken. She said exactly what she thought and exactly what she meant. And she said it to men as well. She wasn't afraid to do that. And I think the other thing that was really interesting about her was she was a risk taker. I think because of that wild and free childhood that she had had, where there were certain responsibilities, and after that you ran wild in the hills and you picked wild fruits and you slid down the rocks, and you really enjoyed yourself. You enjoyed the wildness of the environment. I think that led her to be a risk taker, an adventurer, and very innovative in the way she organized. She always had some kind of different idea or a different way of approaching it, or idea about how we should do this. And she would always discuss that with membership, but she was a very effective organizer because of that. And people saw that. They saw that here is a woman who is capable of leadership. And so when the idea of the Transport and General Workers Union was mooted, because the unions were sort of built piece by piece, she was put forward as somebody who would be the general secretary. And I think it was also because at that time there was a huge debate that was going on about, do you organize the unions in sectors, i.e. industrial unions, maybe it was food or metal or transport or whatever, or do you organize them in one huge union and build your power that way? And Mam Lydia fell somewhere in between. And so she saw the possibility of transport workers really building the power of other workers who were much weaker, like security and cleaners. So she was also seen as appropriate for organizing the Transport and General Union. It wasn't so unusual at that time. There were about 5 women leaders, actually, but now you'll never find a woman general secretary in a union. It's just very unusual.
And while serving in Parliament, Lydia was deeply committed to her work and prided herself on never being late for a meeting. What were the focal areas of her work in Parliament?
I think we need to think of Parliament in those days before this horrible corruption and inefficiency that sort of happened 2000 onwards had eroded the power of Parliament. At that time, people were very enthused. They were very committed to changing South Africa and to giving people rights and making it more easy for people who were impoverished to change their circumstances. And so when Mam Lydia came into Parliament, it was a huge difference for her. She'd been in resistance mode. She'd been an organizer. She'd been an activist. Now she suddenly had to build a country, and she had to build something in a positive way. And so I think she looked around her and she saw that the place to do this is the portfolio committee. That if you're in a portfolio committee, that's where you have a voice. That's where you can start discussing things. And that's where you have the power for recommendations to go forward. And so the first portfolio committee that she joined was the Land Affairs Committee. And the reason why she did that was because women in rural areas had absolutely no rights over the land. In the homelands, men owned all the lands, and chiefs owned all the land. And it was then allocated to men. And she wanted women to own the land in their own right and be able to work it so that they could change their circumstances and bring some kind of wealth and power into their lives. And so wherever there was any kind of discussion or potential law that was going to be passed, you would find Mam Lydia pushing it. So she was very involved in the passing of the Domestic Violence Act. She was very involved in the recognition of Customary Marriages Act, because at that time what happened was you could not divorce if you were in a customary marriage in the rural areas. You could, if you'd been married, by a magistrate, you could get a divorce. So if you had an abusive husband or a husband that didn't give you anything or had disappeared and gone into the city, there was nothing you could do about it. You were locked into this marriage and into that man's family. So she was very instrumental in pushing that law, which did actually go through. And she also worked very hard on the Women's Commission. There was a Women's Commission in Parliament, which at some period was led by Craig's Governor. She really relied on Mam Lydia, and I talk about that in the book. And she talks about it in the book, for representing and making people aware of what was happening to rural women. And they also did this wonderful thing of producing a woman's budget. So every year a budget would come out that was just about women, a portfolio for women. And they produced this lovely book that was given out publicly and widely in South Africa about what actually women's needs were and why they needed this kind of budgetary concern. Unfortunately, at that time, I can only call him misogynist. There was a minister in charge of women and children and disability called Esap Pahad, and he was absolutely abusive. And he was abusive particularly to Mam Lydia because I think she was very outspoken. And he said that she didn't know anything about rural women and she didn't understand the issues. And he actually stopped this whole budgetary process. So she had some successes because she was very vocal, but I think she also had some really being put into her place as a woman,
And lastly, Kally, could you please explain the significance of the book's title, Lydia?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the word Lydia, it's about Lydia, it's a biography about Lydia. She was called different things at different times, which the book actually goes into. She was called Mam Lydia, Lydia Komape, Lydia Kompe, Lydia Ngwenya, and it depended on the period of her life. The subtitle of the book is an anthem to the unity of women. And as you know, an anthem is a rousing song which is sung in unison, very often in a gospel or in a church choir, where people come together and they really, I suppose, sing a praise song. And this is what I felt I wanted to do with Mam Lydia. I wanted to sing a praise song to her. But I also feel that for Mam Lydia, the organizational imperative was strongest, and for her unity and the fact that when women came together, they had real power and they could really change things was absolutely critical. And you'll see that there are some examples, for example, in Mutsi in Limpopo, where women became extremely powerful and really started to change local development issues to better their families and themselves. So, yeah, that was really my idea behind the title.
That was Kally Forrest discussing her book, Lydia, Anthem to the Unity of Women.